At 3 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, Evan Brooks made a choice that would save thousands of lives. But first, it threatened to destroy the only thing he had left, his ability to provide for his daughter. This is the story of one man who refused to stay silent when everyone told him to look the other way, and the billionaire who learned that integrity can't be bought, but it can be honored. If you believe that doing the right thing still matters, even when no one's watching, stay with me until the end of this story. And if it moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The fluorescent lights in the employment office buzzed like dying insects, casting a sickly yellow glow over the plastic chairs where desperate men waited for work they'd never admit to needing. Evan Brooks sat in the back row, his daughter's school picture folded in his wallet like a talisman against failure. He'd been staring at the same water-stained ceiling tile for 20 minutes, counting the seconds between each drop that fell into a dented bucket in the corner. Brooks! Evan Brooks! He stood, feeling the eyes of every other man in the room track his movement toward the dispatcher's window. They all knew what was coming. Everyone had heard about the Harrington Tower night shift, the job that had churned through 6 guards in 3 months. Equipment failures, unexplained incidents. One guard claimed he'd heard things in the walls. Another just stopped showing up after his second night. No explanation, no final paycheck collected. The dispatcher, a heavy-set woman named Gloria, who'd seen enough broken men to recognize one at first glance, didn't bother with pleasantries. "You sure about this?" she asked, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "I got a warehouse gig. Less money, but it's steady. Day shift." "I need the night differential," Evan said quietly. "And the building's downtown, closer to my daughter's school." Gloria's expression softened slightly. She'd heard about his wife, everyone in the agency had. Cancer 2 years ago, medical bills that could crush a man who'd already been living paycheck to paycheck, a 6-year-old daughter who needed more than a broken father could provide. "The Harrington Tower pays premium because nobody wants it," Gloria said, leaning forward. "I'm legally obligated to tell you that several previous employees have filed complaints about working conditions. Management disputes those claims, but I'll take it," Evan interrupted. "Evan, listen to me." Gloria's voice dropped to something almost maternal. "I've been doing this job for 15 years. I've placed guys in factories, construction sites, places where people actually die on the job. And I'm telling you, there's something wrong with that building. I can't explain it, but every single guard who's worked there looks like they've seen something they can't unsee." Evan met her gaze steadily. "I'm a widower raising a 6-year-old on his own. I've already seen plenty I can't unsee. At least this job pays enough for me to keep the lights on and put food on the table." Gloria sighed and began typing. "Orientation is tomorrow at 4 p.m. Shift starts at 10 p.m. You'll be solo from 10 to 6 a.m. The building is mostly empty at night, just a few late working executives and cleaning crews. Your job is to monitor security feeds, do regular floor checks, and respond to any alerts." She slid a packet of papers across the counter. "Sign here, here, and initial here. This waiver acknowledges that you've been informed of previous employee complaints and that you accept the position at your own discretion." Evan barely glanced at the documents before signing. He'd signed away pieces of his soul to keep his daughter fed and housed. One more form meant nothing. "One more thing," Gloria said as he turned to leave. "The building is owned by Claire Harrington. You might have heard of her. Billionaire real estate developer, family empire, all that. She's rarely there, but if you do see her, keep your head down and your mouth shut. People at her level don't like being reminded that the help exists." Evan nodded and walked out into the cold morning air, clutching the papers that represented his latest attempt to outrun financial disaster. The Harrington Tower. He'd seen it from a distance. 53 stories of glass and steel rising above the city like a monument to someone else's success. Tomorrow night, he'd walk through its doors as the lowest person in its hierarchy, a ghost hired to watch over emptiness. He pulled out his phone and called his neighbor, Mrs. Chen, a retired teacher who'd become his lifeline when his wife died. "I got the job," he said when she answered. "The tower?" Mrs. Chen's voice carried notes of concern. "Evan, I heard things about that place." "I heard them too," Evan said, watching early morning traffic stream past. "But it pays 40% more than anything else I've been offered. That's the difference between making rent and explaining to Sophie why we have to move again. There was a long pause. Sophie's doing fine here. She's a strong little girl, just like her father. I don't feel very strong, Evan admitted, the words escaping before he could stop them. I feel like I'm barely holding on, and every decision I make is just choosing which catastrophe to postpone. That's what strength looks like sometimes, Mrs. Chen said gently. The jobs we take, the sacrifices we make, our children see those things, Evan. They learn what it means to be responsible, to honor your commitments even when everything feels impossible. After they hung up, Evan stood on the street corner for a long moment, watching the city wake up around him. Somewhere in that vertical maze of glass and concrete, his daughter was probably having breakfast, chattering about her upcoming school play. She wanted him to come to the rehearsal on Thursday evening. He'd have to miss it. The new shift started Wednesday, and he couldn't risk calling out during his first week. Another small failure to add to the growing list. Another moment he wouldn't get back. He pushed the thought away and headed home, trying to remember when he'd last felt like something more than a collection of obligations and exhaustion. The Harrington Towers employee entrance existed in a liminal space beneath the building's gleaming facade, a concrete tunnel that smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee, where the people who maintained the illusion of corporate perfection passed through without ever being seen by those who benefited from their work. Evan arrived for orientation wearing his only decent pair of slacks and a button-down shirt that had seen better days. The security manager, a retired cop named Dennis Walsh, met him in a cramped office that felt more like an interrogation room than a workspace. "You read the manual?" Walsh asked, not looking up from his computer. "Yes, sir." "Good. Because I'm only going through this once, and if you screw up, it's your ass, not mine." Walsh finally made eye contact, his expression suggesting he'd already written Evan off as another temporary body filling a vacant slot. "Your shift is 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., Sunday through Thursday. You'll have Friday and Saturday off. You're responsible for the entire building, all 53 floors, the parking garage, and the executive penthouse level." Walsh pulled out a laminated map covered in color-coded zones. "You'll start each shift with a full building sweep. Takes about 2 hours if you do it right. After that, you monitor the security station on the ground floor. Cameras cover the main entrances, elevators, and parking areas. If you see anything unusual, you log it. If it's an emergency, you call the police and then call me, in that order." "What counts as unusual?" Evan asked. "Use your judgment. We get homeless people trying to sleep in the parking garage sometimes. We get delivery guys who show up at the wrong address. We get drunk executives who forget where they parked. You're not a cop. You don't arrest anybody. You're eyes and ears. You observe. You report. You stay out of trouble." Walsh handed him a heavy key ring and an access card. "This gets you into every floor except the executive penthouse. That's biometric access only, fingerprint and retinal scan. If you ever need to access that level, you call me first. Understood?" "Understood." "The building systems are mostly automated," Walsh continued, pulling up a complex interface on his computer. "HVAC, lighting, fire suppression, all controlled from a central system. You don't touch any of that. If something seems wrong, you log it and move on. Maintenance handles technical issues." Evan nodded, trying to absorb the flood of information while fighting off the exhaustion that had become his constant companion. "Previous guards mentioned," he began, but Walsh cut him off. "Previous guards couldn't handle the isolation. Night shift security is 90% boredom and 10% staying awake. If you can't handle being alone with your thoughts for 8 hours, this isn't the job for you." Walsh's tone made it clear he'd had this conversation before and didn't appreciate having it again. "I can handle it," Evan said. "We'll see." Walsh stood, signaling the orientation was over. "Your uniform is in the locker room. You're expected to maintain a professional appearance at all times. The people who work in this building don't want to be reminded that security exists. Your background scenery, invisible unless something goes wrong." As Evan followed Walsh through the service corridors, he caught glimpses of the building's public face through doorways and windows, soaring atriums filled with natural light, marble floors that reflected like mirrors, art installations that probably cost more than his annual salary. It was a different world, separated from his underground realm by more than just floors and walls. The locker room smelled of bleach and old sweat. Walsh handed him a dark blue uniform with Harrington Security embroidered over the breast pocket and left without ceremony. Evan changed slowly, catching his reflection in a spotted mirror. The uniform fit poorly, too tight across the shoulders and too loose at the waist. He looked exactly like what he was, a desperate man wearing borrowed authority, hoping no one looked too closely. His phone buzzed with a text from Sophie, sent from Mrs. Chen's phone. "Daddy, I miss you. When are you coming home?" He typed back. "Soon, sweetheart. Be good for Mrs. Chen. I love you." 3 sentences that felt like lies and truth simultaneously. He'd be home at dawn, exhausted and hollow. She'd be asleep. They'd miss each other again, ships passing in the night of his necessity. He pocketed his phone and headed back toward Walsh's office for his first official shift, trying to ignore the way the building seemed to press down from above, 53 stories of other people's ambitions balanced on his shoulders. 10 p.m. came with an almost supernatural quiet. The day shift guard, a young guy named Marcus who looked relieved to be leaving, gave Evan a quick handoff at the security desk. "Nothing weird today," Marcus said, gathering his belongings. "Couple executives working late on 47, cleaning crews finishing up on the lower floors, standard Wednesday night." "The previous guards who left," Evan said carefully, "did they mention anything specific?" Marcus hesitated, his hand on his bag. "Look, I work days. I don't know what happens here after dark. But I will say this. The building feels different at night. Sounds travel weird. Shadows fall wrong. Maybe it's just psychology, your brain playing tricks because you're alone in a big empty space, but maybe it's not." "That's not reassuring," Evan said. "You want reassurance, go work at a mall." Marcus headed toward the exit, then paused. "One more thing. If you hear sounds in the walls, humming, clicking, whatever, don't investigate. It's just the building settling. Old HVAC systems, pipes expanding and contracting. You start chasing every noise, you'll drive yourself crazy." After Marcus left, Evan sat at the security desk and surveyed his new domain. 12 monitors showed different views of the building: lobby, parking garage, elevator banks, loading dock. Everything looked normal, quiet, safe. He pulled out the inspection checklist and began his first full building sweep. The lower floors were straightforward, offices empty and dark, cleaning crews working methodically through conference rooms and cubicles. Evan nodded to them as he passed, receiving wary looks in return. The invisible man making his rounds. By the time he reached the 30th floor, the cleaning crews had finished and descended, leaving him truly alone. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of his footsteps on polished floors and the distant hum of ventilation systems. Floor 35, floor 40, floor 45, floor Ops, each level identical to the last. Glass offices overlooking the city, expensive furniture arranged in careful patterns, motivational posters about teamwork and excellence that meant nothing to the man checking door locks at midnight. On floor 47, Evan found the late working executives Marcus had mentioned. 3 men in expensive suits, shirts unbuttoned and ties loosened, gathered around a conference table covered in documents and laptop computers. They didn't acknowledge his presence as he walked past their glass-walled war room. To them, he was furniture, a function, not a person. He continued upward, his legs aching from the stairs he'd chosen to take instead of the elevator. The fitness tracker he'd bought during a brief period of optimistic self-improvement showed he'd already walked 3 miles, and he wasn't even halfway through the shift. Floor 50, floor 51, floor 52, and then finally, floor 53, the executive penthouse level where the biometric scanner blinked red at his access card. Evan peered through the reinforced glass doors at the darkened space beyond. Even from this distance, he could see it was different from the floors below. Real art on the walls, furniture that looked handcrafted rather than catalog ordered. The kind of space where decisions affecting thousands of lives were made over catered lunches and imported coffee. Claire Harrington's domain. The woman who owned this monument to vertical ambition, who probably had no idea that a widowed father was walking her hallways at midnight, checking locks and trying not to think about his daughter sleeping without him. He turned away from the penthouse and began his descent, following the checklist's prescribed route through mechanical rooms and maintenance areas most people never knew existed. That's when he first noticed it. In the mechanical room on floor 42, A red light blinked on a control panel labeled Fire Suppression System. Not the steady green that indicated normal function, but a persistent red that suggested something was wrong. Evan checked his manual. The section on building systems was frustratingly vague. Report any unusual system indicators to maintenance supervisor. Do not attempt to diagnose or repair technical issues. He photographed the blinking light with his phone and made a note in his log. 11:47 p.m. Floor 42 mechanical room. Fire suppression system showing red indicator light. Then he continued his rounds, trying to ignore the small knot of unease forming in his chest. By 1 a.m., he was back at the security desk, feet throbbing, eyes burning with the unique exhaustion of forced alertness. The building had settled into its nighttime rhythm. The slight groans of steel and concrete adjusting to temperature changes, the whisper of air through ventilation shafts, the occasional ping of an elevator reaching its destination on some automated cleaning protocol. Evan pulled out his phone and scrolled through photos of Sophie. Her first day of kindergarten. Last Halloween, dressed as a superhero. Her mother's funeral, standing beside him in a too large black dress, not understanding why mommy wouldn't wake up. He'd promised his dying wife that he'd take care of their daughter, that he'd make sure Sophie had opportunities, education, a future that extended beyond the poverty that had defined their own childhoods. Every job he took, every shift he worked, every moment of exhaustion and desperation, it was all in service of that promise. Even this one. Even a job in a building that made other men quit in fear. Working hours that meant he'd miss his daughter's waking life, becoming a ghost in his own home. At 2:15 a.m., Evan's radio crackled to life. Security, this is Executive Suite B on 47. We need coffee. Can you send someone up? Evan picked up the radio, confused. This is security. I'm not sure. Figure it out, the voice interrupted. There's a coffee service on floor 30. Bring a full pot and 3 cups. Black, no sugar. The radio went silent before Evan could respond. He stared at the device for a long moment, processing this unexpected addition to his duties. The manual had said nothing about coffee service, but the executives on 47 were working late, and apparently, in their world, the night security guard was interchangeable with any other service employee. Evan headed to floor 30, found the coffee service area, and prepared a pot according to the instructions posted on the wall. He carried the tray to floor 47, his security uniform feeling more like a servant's livery with each step. The executives barely glanced up when he entered their conference room. About time, one of them muttered. Put it on the credenza. Evan set down the tray and turned to leave. Wait, another executive said, this one younger than the others, with the kind of casual arrogance that came from never having worried about money. You're new. What happened to the last guy? I don't know, sir, Evan said. I just started tonight. They all quit, the third executive said, not looking up from his laptop. Every single one. You think this one will last longer? I need this job, Evan said quietly. So yes, I'll last. The younger executive laughed. They all need the job. That's why they take it. But needing something and enduring something are different things, aren't they? Evan didn't respond. He left the conference room and returned to his desk, the executive's laughter following him down the hallway like mockery made audible. At 3 a.m., during his second building sweep, Evan returned to the mechanical room on floor 42. The red light was still blinking. He opened his manual again, reading the fire suppression section more carefully. The Harrington Tower used an advanced FM 200 system, a clean agent fire suppression system that protected sensitive equipment and documents by displacing oxygen rather than using water or foam. The system was designed to detect fires early and suppress them before they could spread. If the system was malfunctioning, that was more than a maintenance issue. That was a safety hazard. Evan took more photographs and made additional notes in his log. Then, following his training, he called the maintenance supervisor's emergency line. The call went to voicemail. He tried the facility manager's number. Same result. Finally, he called Dennis Walsh, the security manager. This better be an emergency, Walsh answered, his voice thick with sleep. Sir, I'm seeing a warning indicator on the fire suppression system in the mechanical room on floor 42. The manual says to report unusual system indicators, so I'm reporting it. There was a long pause. What kind of indicator? A red light. The panel shows the system in some kind of error state. Another pause, longer this time. Did you try resetting it? The manual says not to touch any building systems. Right, okay. Look, log it in the report and send it to maintenance. They'll check it out during business hours. But if the fire suppression system is down, Brooks, listen to me carefully. That building has 15 different redundant safety systems. One warning light doesn't mean the whole place is going to burn down. You log it, you report it, and you let the people who get paid to fix things do their jobs. Your job is to watch, not to panic. Understood? Understood, Evan said, though his unease hadn't diminished. Good. Now, unless the building is actually on fire, don't call me again tonight. Walsh hung up. Evan sat in the mechanical room for a long moment, staring at the blinking red light. Something felt wrong, not just the indicator itself, but the casual dismissal of his concern. The implication that he was overreacting, making trouble where none existed. He'd heard that tone before, in other jobs, other situations. The tone that said, "You're replaceable. Don't make waves. Accept what you're told and be grateful for the opportunity." But his wife had died because they'd ignored warning signs, because doctors had dismissed her concerns until the cancer had spread too far to stop, because people with power had made her feel crazy for trusting her own instincts. Evan pulled out his phone and began photographing everything in the mechanical room. The control panel, the warning light, the inspection logs mounted on the wall beside the system, and that's when he saw it. The inspection logs showed weekly maintenance checks, each one signed off as system normal, no issues. The most recent entry was dated 3 days ago, but the inspection log sheet was pristine, no smudges, no wear, no coffee stains or bent corners. It looked like it had been printed that morning and posted on the wall without anyone ever actually reviewing the system it supposedly documented. Evan flipped through the pages. Every single inspection for the past 3 months showed the same entry. System normal, no issues. Same handwriting, same signature, no variation whatsoever. Either the building had experienced perfect mechanical performance for 12 consecutive weeks, or someone was falsifying inspection reports. His hands shook slightly as he photographed every page of the log. At 4 a.m., Evan was back at his desk, staring at his phone and trying to decide what to do with what he'd found. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe the maintenance team really was that consistent. Maybe he was seeing conspiracy where only bureaucratic repetition existed. But the red light kept blinking in his memory, and the falsified logs felt like evidence of something darker than simple negligence. He thought about Sophie, asleep in Mrs. Chen's apartment. He thought about the promise he'd made to his dying wife. He thought about the executives on floor 47, working late and treating him like furniture, unaware that the building protecting their late-night ambitions might be compromised. He thought about all the people who would walk through these doors tomorrow, employees and visitors and cleaning crews and delivery drivers, thousands of people trusting that someone was keeping them safe. And he thought about the 6 guards who'd quit before him, each one unwilling or unable to last more than a few weeks in this job. What had they seen? What had they known? At 5 a.m., with dawn still an hour away, Evan made a decision. He logged into the security system and began reviewing archived footage from the mechanical room on floor 42. If the maintenance team was doing actual inspections, the cameras would have captured them. It took him 20 minutes to figure out the interface and locate the right camera feed. When he finally accessed the footage from the past week, what he saw made his stomach turn. No one had entered that mechanical room in 7 days. The inspection log showed daily checks. The camera footage showed an empty room day after day, with nothing but the blinking red light marking the passage of time. Evan sat back in his chair, his heart pounding. This wasn't negligence, this was active fraud. Someone was falsifying safety inspections, creating a paper trail of maintenance that never happened. And if they were doing it for the fire suppression system, what else were they lying about? The building around him suddenly felt different, not empty, but hollow. A beautiful facade hiding structural rot. As dawn began to lighten the sky beyond the tower's windows, Evan gathered his evidence. Photographs, notes, and archived footage metadata. He didn't know what he was going to do with it yet. Didn't know who he could trust or what reporting this might cost him. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He couldn't walk away. Couldn't pretend he hadn't seen what he'd seen. Couldn't be another person who stayed silent while danger accumulated in the shadows. His daughter's face appeared in his mind. Her smile, her trust, her absolute faith that her father would always do the right thing. Even when the right thing might destroy everything he'd been desperately trying to build. At 6 a.m., the day shift guard arrived to relieve him. Evan gathered his things, exhausted and wired simultaneously, and walked out into the cold morning air. The Harrington Tower rose above him, glass and steel gleaming in the early light, beautiful and terrible, and full of secrets that no one with power wanted exposed. Evan pulled out his phone and looked at his daughter's photo one more time. Then he started walking home, knowing that tonight he'd return to that building, and that every hour he stayed silent made him complicit in whatever disaster was waiting to happen. The job no one wanted had become something much more complicated than a paycheck. It had become a test of exactly who Evan Brooks was, and what kind of man his daughter would remember him to be. Evan sat at Mrs. Chen's kitchen table Thursday morning, nursing lukewarm coffee while his daughter ate breakfast 6 feet away, chattering about the upcoming school play. Sophie had been cast as a tree in the forest scene, a role she took with absolute seriousness, practicing her swaying in the wind movements between bites of cereal. And Miss Rodriguez said trees are very important because they give oxygen, Sophie explained, her spoon pausing midair. So even though I don't have words, I'm still helping the whole forest breathe. That's exactly right, sweetheart, Evan said, trying to focus on her words while his mind kept circling back to the blinking red light and the falsified inspection logs. He'd barely slept after his shift, lying on Mrs. Chen's couch for 3 fitful hours before Sophie's alarm woke them both. Daddy, you're not listening, Sophie said, her voice carrying that particular note of childhood disappointment that cut deeper than any criticism from an adult. I am listening. You're a tree. You help the forest breathe, and I'm very proud of you. But you look sad. Sophie set down her spoon and studied him with the unsettling perceptiveness that children sometimes display. Are you sad because of your new job? Mrs. Chen, washing dishes at the sink, glanced over her shoulder with concern. I'm not sad, Evan said, reaching across the table to squeeze his daughter's small hand. I'm just tired. Night shifts take some getting used to. Mommy used to say that tired and sad look the same on the outside but different on the inside, Sophie said quietly. She said the important thing was knowing which one you really are. Evan felt something crack in his chest. His wife had been good at that, seeing through his attempts to hide worry behind claims of exhaustion. She'd known him well enough to recognize when he was carrying burdens he didn't know how to put down. Your mommy was very smart, he said, and right now, I'm both. Tired because of work and sad because I miss spending time with you. Sophie considered this with the gravity of a much older person. But you're working so we can stay together, right? So that's good sadness. That's the kind that means you love me. That's exactly what it means. Evan stood and kissed the top of her head, breathing in the strawberry scent of her shampoo. I need to sleep for a few hours before tonight's shift, but I'll see you tomorrow morning, okay? And this weekend we'll do something special, just you and me. After Sophie left for school with Mrs. Chen, Evan returned to his own apartment, a studio barely large enough for 2 people, with a Murphy bed that folded out from the wall and a kitchenette that consisted of a hot plate and a mini fridge. He'd given Sophie the bed last night while he took the couch, a routine they'd fallen into that neither of them acknowledged as anything other than normal. He lay down on the unmade bed and closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time he started to drift off, he saw the red light blinking, saw the pristine inspection logs with their identical entries, saw thousands of people walking through those tower doors, trusting that someone was keeping them safe. Finally, at noon, he gave up on rest and pulled out his laptop, an ancient machine that took 5 minutes to boot up and longer to connect to their building's spotty Wi-Fi. He spent the next 3 hours researching fire suppression systems, building codes, and safety regulations. What he learned made his unease crystallize into something close to certainty. FM 200 systems required monthly inspections by certified technicians, annual comprehensive testing, documentation that could be audited by fire marshals and insurance companies, the kind of maintenance that couldn't be faked with a signature on a log sheet. If the Harrington Tower's fire suppression system was actually being maintained according to code, there should be detailed service records, parts receipts, technician certifications, The kind of paper trail that proved compliance. Evan knew where those records would be kept. In the facility management office on floor 50C, an office that was locked during his shift, accessible only to daytime administrative staff. Unless someone with a master key happened to find a reason to check. At 9:30 that evening, Evan returned to the Harrington Tower feeling like he was preparing for something more significant than a security shift. He'd showered, shaved, made sure his uniform was as presentable as possible. Looking professional. Looking like someone who had every right to be asking questions. Marcus, the day shift guard, seemed surprised to see him back. "You survived night 1, Marcus said, gathering his belongings. "That's further than 2 of the previous guys made it." "It was fine," Evan said, taking his position at the desk. Quiet. Uneventful. "Tonight might be different. There's some big presentation happening tomorrow morning, board meeting or investor pitch or something. Half the executive team is working late. You'll probably get sent on coffee runs all night." "Great," Evan muttered. After Marcus left, Evan began his building sweep, this time with a specific destination in mind. He made his way methodically through the lower floors, checking doors and noting activity, but his real attention was focused on reaching floor 15 without drawing attention. The facility management office was located in an interior corridor, away from the windows and the prestige views. Evan had his master key ready, his cover story prepared if anyone asked why he was accessing administrative spaces in the middle of the night. The door opened smoothly. Inside, the office looked like every other corporate workspace. Cubicles, filing cabinets, motivational posters encouraging teamwork and excellence. But Evan wasn't interested in the public face of facility management. He was interested in the locked filing cabinets along the back wall, labeled Maintenance Records, Confidential. His master key worked on the first cabinet. Inside, he found folders organized by building system, HVAC, electrical, plumbing, elevators. And there, near the bottom, a thick folder labeled Fire Suppression, Annual Compliance. Evan pulled out his phone and began photographing documents. What he found was worse than he'd imagined. The last genuine fire suppression inspection had been conducted 18 months ago. Since then, every report in the file was a duplicate. The same document, reprinted with updated dates, signed by someone named Thomas Garrett, who, according to his technician certification, had died 7 months ago. Someone had been systematically forging inspection reports for more than a year, using a dead man's credentials to create the illusion of compliance. And based on the volume of paperwork, it wasn't limited to fire suppression. HVAC inspections, elevator maintenance, structural assessments, all of it falsified, all of it signed by contractors who either didn't exist or were no longer alive to contradict the fraud. Evan's hands shook as he photographed page after page, his phone's camera clicking in the silent office like an accusation. This wasn't just negligence, this was a criminal conspiracy. Someone was systematically avoiding the costs of actual building maintenance by creating fake documentation, gambling that nothing would fail catastrophically enough to expose the deception. And everyone working in this building, from the billionaire in the penthouse to the cleaning crews on the lower floors, was at risk because of it. Evan was so focused on documenting the evidence that he almost didn't hear the elevator doors open down the hall. Footsteps. Multiple people. Voices discussing quarterly projections and market positioning. He quickly returned the folders to their cabinet, locked it, and slipped out of the office, pulling the door shut behind him just as 3 executives rounded the corner. "Evening," one of them said, barely glancing at Evan as they passed. To them, he was scenery, invisible. Evan nodded and continued his rounds, his heart pounding, his phone heavy with evidence in his pocket. By midnight, he was back at the security desk, staring at his phone and trying to decide what to do next. The responsible thing would be to report this to building management. Let the proper authorities investigate. Follow the chain of command like he'd been trained to do in every job he'd ever held. But something stopped him. The falsified records weren't random mistakes or isolated incidents. They represented systematic fraud that had to involve multiple people, facility managers, administrative staff, possibly executives who benefited from the cost savings. If he reported this to building management, he'd be reporting it to the very people who were likely responsible. At 12:30, Evan's radio crackled. "Security, this is Executive Suite B on 47. We need you up here." Evan grabbed his radio. What's the issue? No issue. We just need to talk to you. Come up. Something in the voice's tone made Evan's stomach tighten, but he couldn't refuse a direct summons from executives working late. He took the elevator to 47 and found the three men from the previous night waiting in their conference room. The younger executive, whose arrogance had been so casually displayed before, gestured to a chair. Sit down, Brooks. That is your name, right? Yes, sir. Evan remained standing. Is there a problem? That depends, the executive said, leaning back in his chair with the kind of relaxed posture that came from never having feared consequences. Dennis Walsh called me this afternoon, said you'd been making noise about some warning light in a mechanical room, bothering maintenance supervisors in the middle of the night, acting like the sky was falling. Evan kept his expression neutral. I saw an indicator that suggested a system malfunction. The manual says to report unusual conditions. The manual also says to use common sense, another executive interjected. Do you have any training in building systems? Any expertise in fire suppression technology? No, sir. Then maybe you should trust that the people who do have that expertise know what they're doing. This building has more safety redundancies than a nuclear power plant. One warning light doesn't mean anything except that you're looking for problems where none exist. The third executive, older than the others and carrying himself with the weight of someone used to being obeyed, leaned forward. Let me be very clear, Brooks. The Harrington Tower employs over 2,000 people. Claire Harrington has built an empire on the reputation of this company and this building. The last thing we need is some overzealous night guard creating panic over routine maintenance issues. With respect, sir, falsified inspection logs aren't routine maintenance issues. The silence that followed was profound. The older executive's expression hardened. What did you just say? Evan knew he'd crossed a line, knew he should backtrack, apologize, claim he'd misspoken. But he thought about Sophie, about his wife, about all the times he'd stayed silent when speaking up might have mattered. I reviewed the maintenance records, Evan said quietly. The fire suppression system hasn't been properly inspected in over a year. The logs show daily checks that never happened. Some of the reports are signed by a technician who died 7 months ago. The younger executive laughed, but there was no humor in it. You broke into a locked office and went through confidential files. Are you insane? I have a master key. Part of my security duties is checking all areas of the building. Your duties are checking door locks and watching monitors, the older executive said coldly. Not conducting amateur investigations into facility management operations. You're a security guard, Brooks. The lowest person in this building's hierarchy. You don't get to make decisions about what is and isn't important. I get to make decisions about what's safe and what isn't, Evan said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. And this building isn't safe. The fire suppression system is compromised, the maintenance records are fraudulent, and everyone working here deserves to know that. The older executive stood slowly, his face flushed with anger. Let me explain something to you. This building is worth $800 million. The Harrington Corporation has annual revenues exceeding $3 billion. Claire Harrington sits on the boards of 6 major companies and employs 15,000 people worldwide. Your concerns about a blinking light and some paperwork irregularities mean absolutely nothing compared to the stability of this organization. He moved closer to Evan, his voice dropping to something almost intimate in its menace. You have a daughter, don't you? Single father, living in a studio apartment in a building that should have been condemned years ago, working night shifts because you can't get anything better. You think you're in a position to make waves, to threaten the livelihoods of people who actually matter? Evan felt something cold settle in his chest. Are you threatening me? I'm explaining reality. You can walk away from this. Forget what you think you saw. Keep doing your job, the job you were hired to do, which is walking hallways and watching cameras. Or you can keep pushing, and if you keep pushing, we'll push back, hard. The younger executive chimed in, his tone almost friendly. Look, Brooks, we get it. You're conscientious, you want to do the right thing, but you're out of your depth here. This is a complex organization with complex systems. What looks like fraud to someone with no background in facility management might actually be standard administrative shortcuts. You don't have the expertise to understand what you're looking at. I understand falsified documents, Evan said. And I understand that if something happens, if there's a fire, if people get hurt, everyone who stayed silent becomes responsible. The older executive's expression turned to something like contempt. Nothing is going to happen. This building has stood for 30 years without incident. It will stand for 30 more. Your paranoia doesn't change that fact. He gestured toward the door. You're dismissed. And Brooks? If I hear that you've been spreading rumors, accessing files you have no business reading, or otherwise making trouble, you'll be terminated immediately. No severance, no references, nothing. Do we understand each other? Evan met his gaze steadily. Yes, sir. We understand each other perfectly. He walked out of the conference room feeling the executive's eyes on his back like physical weight. The elevator ride back to the ground floor felt longer than usual, the building pressing in from all sides. Back at the security desk, Evan sat in the flickering glow of the monitors and tried to think clearly through the fear and anger competing for dominance in his mind. They'd threatened him, threatened his daughter, made it clear that speaking up would cost him everything he'd been desperately trying to hold together. But they'd also confirmed his suspicions. If the maintenance irregularities were innocent, they would have laughed off his concerns. Instead, they'd resorted to intimidation, which meant they knew. They knew the building's systems were compromised, and they were actively covering it up. At 2 a.m., Evan pulled out his phone and stared at the evidence he'd accumulated. Photographs of falsified logs, video timestamps showing empty mechanical rooms, documentation of a criminal conspiracy that put thousands of lives at risk. He could delete it all. Pretend this night never happened. Show up tomorrow and every night after, do his rounds, keep his mouth shut, collect his paychecks. Be the invisible man they'd hired him to be. He thought about his daughter's face when he dropped her off at school. The absolute trust in her eyes when she'd said that his sadness meant he loved her. The way she believed, with complete faith, that her father always did the right thing. What would he tell her someday when she asked about this moment? Would he say he'd stayed silent because speaking up was too risky? Because powerful people had threatened him and he'd been too afraid to push back? Would he teach her that integrity was negotiable? That doing the right thing only mattered when it was convenient? His wife's voice echoed in his memory, something she'd said during her final days when the morphine couldn't quite mask the pain, but couldn't silence her determination to leave him with something to hold on to. Promise me you'll teach Sophie to be brave, not fearless. Fear is healthy, but brave. Brave enough to do the hard things even when she's scared. Brave enough to stand up when everyone else sits down. He'd made that promise, and now it was being tested in ways he'd never imagined. At 3 a.m., Evan made his decision. He couldn't go to building management. They were part of the problem. He couldn't trust the executives who'd threatened him. But there were other authorities, fire marshals, building inspectors, regulatory agencies whose entire purpose was preventing exactly this kind of dangerous fraud. He opened his laptop and began composing a detailed report, attaching every photograph, every piece of evidence he'd collected, names, dates, specific violations, a comprehensive document that couldn't be ignored or buried. As he typed, the building around him seemed to hold its breath. The monitors showed empty hallways, quiet floors, thousands of tons of glass and steel suspended above the city in apparent stability. But Evan knew now what hid behind that facade, knew that every day this fraud continued was another day closer to catastrophe. By 4 a.m., his report was complete. He'd addressed it to the city's fire marshal, the state building inspector, and the Occupational Safety Administration. Multiple recipients, multiple agencies, making it impossible for any single person to suppress the information. His finger hovered over the send button. Once he pressed it, there would be no going back. An investigation would be launched. The building would be scrutinized. And everyone involved in the fraud, from low-level facility managers to high-ranking executives, would know exactly who had exposed them. The older executive's words echoed in his mind. If you keep pushing, we'll push back. Hard. They would destroy him, cost him this job, make sure he never worked in corporate security again, possibly bring legal action claiming he'd violated confidentiality agreements or accessed files illegally. They had resources he couldn't match and connections he couldn't fight. But they couldn't erase the truth, couldn't change the fact that this building was dangerous and people deserved to know. Evan thought about his daughter one more time, imagined her years from now, learning what he'd done. Would she be proud? Would she understand that sometimes being a good father meant risking everything to do what was right? Or would she resent him for choosing strangers over their security, for throwing away their stability for principles that didn't pay rent or put food on the table? He didn't know, couldn't know. All he had was the promise he'd made to his dying wife, and the faith that teaching Sophie about courage meant showing her courage in action, even when it terrified him, even when it might cost him everything. He pressed send. The report disappeared into the digital void, bound for multiple inboxes across various government agencies. An accusation that couldn't be unsent. Evidence that couldn't be erased. Evan sat back in his chair, feeling simultaneously lighter and heavier than he'd ever felt before. He'd done it. He'd spoken up. And now all that remained was waiting to see what consequences his honesty would bring. At 5:30, as dawn approached and his shift neared its end, Evan conducted one final walk through the mechanical room on floor 42. The red light still blinked its persistent warning. The falsified logs still hung on the wall, their lies preserved in official-looking documentation. But they wouldn't remain hidden much longer. By tomorrow, maybe the day after, inspectors would arrive. Questions would be asked. The fraud would be exposed. And Evan Brooks, single father, widower, the invisible man hired to watch but not to see, would have done something that actually mattered. Whatever came next, he'd face it knowing he'd honored his promise to his wife and his daughter. That when confronted with a choice between silence and truth, he'd chosen truth, even if it destroyed him. As he walked back to the security desk for the last hour of his shift, Evan noticed something he hadn't seen before. A small crack in one of the building's interior support columns, barely visible unless you knew where to look. Just another sign of deterioration hiding behind expensive marble and polished glass. The Harrington Tower was falling apart from the inside, and everyone had been too busy maintaining appearances to notice the rot spreading through its foundations. But they would notice now. They had to. Because Evan Brooks had refused to stay silent, and sometimes that was all it took to change everything. The day shift guard arrived promptly at 6, and Evan handed over the desk with mechanical efficiency, saying nothing about the report he'd filed or the reckoning that was coming. He walked out into the cold morning air, exhausted and terrified, and somehow more certain of himself than he'd been in years. His phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Chen. Sophie had a nightmare last night. Asked when you're coming home. She needs her father. Evan replied, I'm on my way, and I have something important to tell her about being brave. The knock came at 7:15 on Friday morning, exactly 43 hours after Evan had pressed send on his report to the city fire marshal. He was standing in Mrs. Chen's kitchen, helping Sophie pack her lunch for school, when he heard it. 3 sharp raps that somehow managed to sound official even through a cheap apartment door. His hands froze mid-motion, a peanut butter sandwich suspended between counter and lunchbox. Are you expecting someone? Mrs. Chen asked, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Evan shook his head, his heart already accelerating. He'd been waiting for this moment, dreading it and anticipating it in equal measure, since he'd walked out of the Harrington Tower 2 nights ago. He'd worked his Thursday shift in a state of heightened alertness, expecting security to escort him out at any moment. But the night had passed without incident, leaving him to wonder if his report had vanished into bureaucratic limbo or if the reckoning was simply delayed. Now, apparently, it had arrived. Stay here with Sophie, he told Mrs. Chen quietly, then walked to the door and opened it. 2 men in dark suits stood in the narrow hallway. The older one, gray-haired and carrying himself with the weary authority of someone who'd seen too many buildings fail and too many people lie about it, held up an official-looking badge. Evan Brooks? I'm Fire Marshal Tom Hendricks. This is Inspector James Morrison from the City Building Department. We need to talk to you about a report you filed regarding the Harrington Tower. Relief and terror competed in Evan's chest. They'd received his report. They were taking it seriously. But their presence at his home, rather than contacting him by phone or email, suggested this was more complicated than he'd hoped. Of course, Evan said, stepping into the hallway and pulling the door partly closed behind him. Should I come to your office? We'd prefer to talk here, if that's possible, Hendricks said. What you've alleged is serious enough that we wanted to verify some details before we proceed with an official investigation. Evan led them down to the building's cramped lobby, a space that smelled of mildew and old carpet, where broken mailboxes lined one wall like monuments to neglect. It wasn't much, but it was private enough for conversation. Hendricks pulled out a tablet and brought up Evan's report. You claim the Harrington Towers fire suppression system hasn't been properly inspected in over 18 months, that maintenance logs have been falsified, that inspection reports are being signed by deceased contractors. Those are criminal allegations, Mr. Brooks. We need to know if you're prepared to stand behind them. I am, Evan said steadily. I have photographs of the falsified logs, video timestamps showing no maintenance personnel entering the mechanical rooms, documentation of reports signed by Thomas Garrett, who according to state records died 7 months ago. Morrison, the building inspector, leaned forward. How did you access confidential facility management files? Those offices are locked outside business hours. I have a master key as part of my security duties. The manual says I'm responsible for checking all areas of the building. But not for accessing confidential administrative files, Morrison said, his tone suggesting this could be a problem. I saw a warning indicator on the fire suppression system, Evan explained. When I tried to report it, I was told it wasn't important, but something about the dismissal felt wrong. So I looked for maintenance records to verify that the system was actually being serviced properly. What I found instead was systematic fraud. Hendricks studied him for a long moment. You understand that making false allegations against a major corporation can result in legal consequences? Defamation lawsuits, criminal charges for accessing files without authorization. I understand, Evan said, but the allegations aren't false. Everything I reported can be verified. Check the inspection logs against actual service records. Interview the contractors whose signatures appear on the reports. Pull the building's compliance documentation and compare it to what the code requires. We intend to, Hendricks said, but I need you to understand something. The Harrington Tower is one of the most prominent buildings in this city. Claire Harrington is a major political donor with connections to the mayor's office, the city council, and half the business community. When we show up with inspection orders based on your report, there will be enormous pressure to find that you're wrong, to discredit you, to make this go away as quietly as possible. Morrison nodded. We've dealt with powerful people before. They lawyer up fast. They call in favors. They make whistleblowers' lives very difficult. Are you prepared for that? Evan thought about his daughter eating breakfast upstairs, unaware that her father's decision might be about to unravel their already fragile stability. He thought about the executives who'd threatened him, their casual certainty that he was too powerless to matter. He thought about his wife's final words about teaching Sophie to be brave. I'm prepared, he said quietly, because if I'm right, if that building's systems are compromised and something happens, people will die. And I'll have to live with knowing I could have prevented it and didn't because I was too scared. Hendricks exchanged a glance with Morrison, and something unspoken passed between them. All right, Hendricks said. We'll conduct a surprise inspection this morning. No advance warning to building management. We'll verify your claims independently. If you're right, we'll move forward with a full investigation. If you're wrong, he let the implication hang in the air. I'm not wrong, Evan said. After the inspectors left, Evan sat on the lobby's stained couch for several minutes, trying to steady his breathing. He'd crossed the Rubicon now, set events in motion that couldn't be called back. In a few hours, inspectors would descend on the Harrington Tower, and everyone who'd been complicit in the fraud would know exactly who had exposed them. When he finally climbed the stairs back to Mrs. Chen's apartment, Sophie was waiting by the door, her backpack already on. Who were those men? She asked, her voice carrying that particular note of childhood anxiety that suggested she'd picked up more from his tension than he'd intended. Just some people from the city, Evan said, kneeling to her level. Nothing for you to worry about. You look worried, Sophie observed. So it must be something big. Evan pulled her into a hug, breathing in her strawberry shampoo and feeling the fierce protectiveness that had defined every decision he'd made since her mother died. Sometimes grown-ups have to do things that are scary because they're the right thing to do, he said, even when we don't know how they'll turn out. Like when Mommy went to the hospital for treatment, Sophie asked quietly. She was scared, but she did it anyway because she wanted to stay with us? The question hit Evan like a physical blow. His wife's battle with cancer had been exactly that. A series of frightening choices made with courage and hope, even when both felt impossibly hard to maintain. Yes, he managed. Exactly like that. And you're being brave now, like Mommy was? I'm trying to be, Evan said. I'm trying very hard. Sophie hugged him tighter. Then it will be okay, because brave people always make things okay, even when it takes a long time. Evan wished he had her certainty. Wished he believed that courage alone could guarantee positive outcomes. But he knew better. Knew that sometimes doing the right thing still led to disaster. That being brave didn't make you invincible. It just meant you faced consequences without looking away. After Sophie left for school, Evan tried to sleep, but couldn't. Instead, he sat on Mrs. Chen's couch, checking his phone obsessively, waiting for news that didn't come. The hours crawled past with excruciating slowness. Noon arrived, 1 o'clock, 2. Finally, at 2:45, his phone rang with an unknown number. Mr. Brooks, this is Tom Hendricks. We've completed our preliminary inspection of the Harrington Tower. Evan's hand tightened on the phone. And? You were right, about everything. Hendricks' voice carried a mixture of grim satisfaction and professional anger. The fire suppression system is critically compromised. Multiple zones are non-functional. The backup systems haven't been tested in over a year. We found falsified records for HVAC maintenance, elevator inspections, and structural assessments. This building has been operating in violation of fire code for at least 18 months, possibly longer. Relief and vindication flooded through Evan, so powerful he had to sit down. What happens now? He asked. We're issuing an immediate violation notice. The building will remain open while remediation takes place, but we're requiring daily inspections until all systems are brought up to code. We're also referring the matter to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation. Someone authorized this fraud, and they're going to face consequences. What about the people working there? Are they safe? For now, yes. But it was closer than anyone wants to admit. If there had been a fire before we caught this... Hendricks didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. You did the right thing, Mr. Brooks. You probably saved lives today. After Hendricks hung up, Evan sat in stunned silence, processing what he'd just heard. He'd been right. His instincts, his investigation, his refusal to stay silent, all of it vindicated. The Harrington Tower's dangerous secrets were exposed. People would be held accountable. But vindication didn't mean protection. He'd made powerful enemies, and they would want revenge. As if summoning them with the thought, his phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed the Harrington Tower's main number. Mr. Brooks, this is Dennis Walsh. You're terminated, effective immediately. Security will collect your badge and keys when you arrive to pick up your final paycheck. You're not to enter any Harrington Corporation property after today. Is that clear? Crystal clear, Evan said. He'd expected this, had known from the moment he filed his report that the job was lost, but hearing it stated so baldly still stung. You made a serious mistake, Walsh continued, his voice hard. You violated confidentiality agreements. You accessed files without authorization. You made defamatory allegations against this company and its leadership. We're currently reviewing our legal options. Review whatever you want, Evan said, finding reserves of calm he didn't know he possessed. The fire marshal confirmed everything I reported. You can threaten me all you like, but the truth doesn't change. The truth, Walsh said coldly, is that you were a temporary employee who overstepped his authority and cost this company millions in emergency repairs and legal exposure. You think you're some kind of hero? You're just another troublemaker who couldn't follow simple instructions. He hung up before Evan could respond. Evan sat staring at his phone, trying to process what had just happened. In the span of 3 hours, he'd been vindicated and fired, proven right, and made unemployed. The building was safer because of him, and he'd lost the job he desperately needed. Sophie would be out of school in an hour. He'd have to pick her up, have to figure out how to explain that Daddy didn't have a job anymore, that the brief stability they'd achieved was evaporating again, that they were back to the edge they'd been teetering on for 2 years. The thought made him feel sick. At 3:30, Evan walked to Sophie's school and waited outside with the other parents, mostly mothers, mostly looking put together in ways that emphasized how completely he didn't belong. When Sophie emerged, her face lit up with the uncomplicated joy that made every sacrifice feel momentarily worthwhile. Daddy, you're here! You usually can't pick me up." "Special day," Evan said, taking her hand. "Let's walk home the long way, through the park." They walked slowly, Sophie chattering about her day, while Evan tried to figure out how to tell her what he needed to tell her. The park was mostly empty on a Friday afternoon, just a few elderly people feeding pigeons and a couple of teenagers cutting class. They sat on a bench overlooking the playground, and Evan finally found the words. "Sophie, I need to tell you something about my job. The night security position at the tower." She looked up at him with those serious eyes that saw too much. "You got fired because you were brave." Evan blinked. "How did you—" "Mrs. Chen told me that sometimes when grown-ups do the right thing, other people get mad at them. And you looked worried this morning, so I figured something like that happened." She swung her legs, her small body somehow containing wisdom beyond her years. "Are we going to be okay?" "We're going to be okay," Evan said, hoping it was true. "I don't know how yet, but we'll figure it out. We always do." "Because you're brave," Sophie said matter-of-factly. "And Mommy said brave people always find a way." They sat together in the cooling afternoon, father and daughter, and Evan felt the weight of responsibility settle even heavier on his shoulders. He'd done the right thing. He'd exposed corruption and potentially saved lives. But righteousness didn't pay rent. Courage didn't put food on the table. And being vindicated by fire marshals didn't help him figure out how to provide for his daughter. That evening, after Sophie was in bed, Evan opened his laptop and began searching for jobs. Security positions, warehouse work, anything that would generate income. But every search felt futile. He'd been fired from his last position for violating confidentiality and making defamatory allegations. No matter how righteous his cause, potential employers would see termination and trouble. He was marked now. Damaged goods in an economy that didn't value whistleblowers. At 11 p.m., his phone buzzed with an email from an address he didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Thank you from a Harrington Tower employee." Evan opened it hesitantly. "Mr. Brooks, you don't know me, but I work on the 32nd floor of the Harrington Tower. Today we were informed about the safety violations you discovered and the inspections that are now happening. I want you to know that there are 2,000 people who come to work in this building every day, and today we learned that someone we've never met put his job on the line to keep us safe. Some of us have children, some of us have families depending on us, and all of us owe you a debt we can never repay. Whatever happens next, please know that what you did mattered. You are a true hero, even if nobody with power will ever admit it. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for caring about strangers. Thank you for being the kind of person who speaks up when everyone else stays silent." Evan read the email 3 times, tears blurring the words by the end. He told himself he was doing this for Sophie, to teach her about integrity. But reading this stranger's gratitude, he realized he'd also done it for every person who walked through those tower doors trusting that someone was keeping them safe, for every parent who kissed their kids goodbye and assumed they'd come home at the end of the day, for every cleaner and executive and security guard whose life had value, whether they knew about the danger or not. He'd saved them. Not dramatically, not visibly, but meaningfully, completely, in ways they'd never fully understand. And somehow, that made the cost bearable. Saturday morning arrived with unexpected news. A voicemail from Fire Marshal Hendricks left at 6 a.m. "Mr. Brooks, something's happened that you need to know about. Claire Harrington, the tower's owner, she's asking to meet with you, personally, at your home, this morning. I told her I'd pass along the message, but that the decision was entirely yours. You don't have to do this. You don't owe her anything, but she was very insistent that she wanted to speak with you directly. If you're willing, she'll be at your address at 9 a.m. Call me if you have concerns." Evan stood in his tiny apartment, phone in hand, trying to process this information. Claire Harrington, billionaire, owner of the tower and the corporation bearing her family name. The woman whose empire he'd just exposed as built partially on fraud and negligence. She was coming here, to his rundown building, to see him. The question was why. At 8:45, Evan made sure Sophie was occupied with Mrs. Chen upstairs, then waited in his apartment with a mixture of curiosity and dread. He'd cleaned as best he could, though there was only so much tidying that could disguise poverty. The Murphy bed was folded into the wall. The kitchenette was spotless. But the cracks in this plaster and the water stains on the ceiling told their own story about the distance between his world and Claire Harrington's. At precisely 9 a.m., there was a knock at the door. Evan opened it to find a woman in her mid-50s dressed in an expensive but understated suit, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a simple style that probably cost more than his monthly rent. She stood alone. No security detail, no assistant, no entourage, just a billionaire on a widower's doorstep, looking almost uncertain. "Mr. Brooks? I'm Claire Harrington. Thank you for seeing me." "I'm not sure I had much choice," Evan said carefully. "Come in." Claire entered the small apartment and looked around without any visible judgment, though Evan was acutely aware of how this space must appear to someone whose office probably had better furnishings than his entire home. "Would you like to sit?" he offered, gesturing to the apartment's only chair. "Thank you." Claire sat, and Evan took a seat on the edge of his bed, leaving a careful distance between them. For a long moment, neither spoke. Claire seemed to be gathering her thoughts, and Evan waited, unsure what protocol governed conversations between billionaires and the people they'd just fired. "I owe you an apology," Claire finally said, "and an explanation. But first, I need to understand something. Why did you do it? You had to know it would cost you your job, that it would make powerful people very angry, that you were risking everything for a building full of strangers. So why?" Evan considered the question carefully. "Because I have a daughter, and every person working in your building is someone's daughter or son or parent or spouse. They trusted that someone was keeping them safe, and I learned that nobody was. So I had to be. Even though it destroyed your livelihood?" "Especially because of that," Evan said. "If I'd stayed silent to protect my job, what would I tell my daughter someday? That I let people stay in danger because speaking up was inconvenient? That other people's lives mattered less than my paycheck?" Claire's expression shifted, something like pain crossing her face. "I built that tower 30 years ago. It was supposed to be my masterpiece. My proof that a woman could create something lasting in an industry that didn't want her. And I was so focused on the empire, on the quarterly reports and the board meetings and the expansion, that I stopped seeing the details that actually mattered." "You didn't know about the fraud?" Evan asked. "I didn't know because I didn't look," Claire said, her voice heavy with something that sounded like self-recrimination. "I hired people to handle operations, trusted them to maintain standards, never questioned whether trust was deserved. The fire marshal's report was horrifying, not just because of what it revealed about my building, but because it revealed what I'd become. Someone so removed from the actual work that I'd let corruption flourish under my name." She leaned forward slightly. 3 executives have been terminated, 2 facility managers. The entire safety compliance department is being restructured. We're conducting comprehensive inspections of every property in the Harrington portfolio, and it's all because you refused to stay silent. "I did what anyone should have done," Evan said, "but most people don't. Most people see problems and look away. They tell themselves it's not their responsibility, not their place, not their problem. You didn't do that. And I need to understand why." Evan thought about his wife, about her final days when she'd made him promise to teach Sophie about courage, about being the kind of parent whose example would shape how their daughter moved through the world. "My wife died 2 years ago," he said quietly. "Cancer. And before she died, she made me promise something. She made me promise to teach our daughter to be brave. Not fearless, but brave. To do hard things even when she's scared. To stand up when everyone else sits down." He met Claire's eyes. "I couldn't teach her that by example if I didn't actually do it myself." Claire was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight of emotion that seemed at odds with her corporate armor. "My father built this company from nothing. He worked 80-hour weeks, sacrificed everything, climbed every ladder there was to climb. And when he died, he left me an empire and a piece of advice. Never trust anyone who has nothing to lose. He meant it as wisdom. Stick with people who have skin in the game, who have reputations to protect. But he was wrong. The people with nothing to lose are the only ones who can tell you the truth." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood where Evan had been trying to build a life for his daughter. "You had everything to lose, Mr. Brooks. Your job, your stability, your ability to provide for your child. And you spoke up anyway. Not because you thought you'd be rewarded, but because it was right. That's extraordinarily rare. It shouldn't be, Evan said. No, Claire agreed. It shouldn't be. But it is. And the question I came here to ask is this: what are you going to do now? Evan almost laughed. Look for another job, I suppose. Try to find something before my savings run out completely. What if I offered you a job? The words hung in the air between them, unexpected and almost incomprehensible. You just fired me, Evan said carefully. Dennis Walsh fired you, Claire corrected, acting on orders from executives who have since been terminated themselves. I'm offering you a different position, a real one. Not night security, watching cameras and walking empty halls, but something that actually uses the qualities you've demonstrated: integrity, attention to detail, the courage to speak up when things are wrong. Evan felt suspicion war with hope. What kind of position? Director of Safety Compliance for all Harrington Corporation properties. You'd oversee inspections, verify maintenance records, ensure that what happened in the tower never happens anywhere else. You'd have authority to access any file, inspect any system, and report directly to me. And you'd have my complete backing to shut down any operation that doesn't meet safety standards, regardless of who complains or what it costs. The offer was so far beyond what Evan had expected that he couldn't immediately process it. From fired security guard to corporate director in one conversation. From poverty wages to what had to be a substantial salary. From invisible to empowered. Why would you trust me with that? He asked. You don't know me. I have no background in corporate management, no executive experience, nothing that qualifies me for that kind of role. You have the only qualification that actually matters, Claire said simply. You care more about doing what's right than about pleasing powerful people. That's worth more than any business degree or years of experience. And frankly, Mr. Brooks, I don't need another yes man telling me what I want to hear. I need someone who will tell me the truth even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. Evan stood and walked to the window beside her, looking out at the neighborhood where he'd been fighting to survive, trying to hold together a life that kept threatening to fall apart. This would change everything, he said quietly, for me and for Sophie. Yes, Claire agreed. It would, but not because I'm offering charity, because you earned it. You saw something wrong and you fixed it, knowing it would cost you. That's the kind of responsibility that most people in positions of power never demonstrate. You showed me what real integrity looks like. Now I'm asking you to help me build that kind of integrity into every property my company operates. Evan turned to face her. And if I find more problems, more fraud, more negligence, more people cutting corners to save money, then you expose it. Every single time. I don't care how embarrassing it is or how much it costs. I built this company on my father's legacy, but I'm not going to let that legacy become a monument to greed and negligence. If that means tearing down and rebuilding entire systems, that's what we'll do. I need this in writing, Evan said. The job description, the authority, the direct reporting relationship, everything. Of course, my lawyer will have contracts ready by Monday. And I need one more thing, Evan added, thinking of Sophie and all the promises he'd made. Flexibility to be present for my daughter, to attend school events, to be there when she needs me. I've missed too much of her life already. Done, Claire said without hesitation. In fact, that's non-negotiable. Children need their parents present. That's something I learned too late with my own kids. She extended her hand. Do we have an agreement? Evan looked at her outstretched hand, manicured, confident, representing a world he'd never imagined accessing. He thought about his daughter upstairs, probably chattering to Mrs. Chen about her upcoming play. He thought about his wife's final wishes. He thought about the anonymous email from the Harrington Tower employee, thanking him for courage. And he thought about the choice he'd made at 3 a.m. in an empty building, when he'd decided that doing what was right mattered more than protecting what little he had. That choice had cost him everything. And somehow, impossibly, it had given him everything back, transformed and deeper and more meaningful than what he'd lost. He took Claire Harrington's hand and shook it firmly. We have an agreement. After Claire Harrington left his apartment that Saturday morning, Evan stood by the window for a long time, watching her town car disappear into traffic. The conversation felt surreal, like something that had happened to someone else, A fairy tale version of his life where courage was rewarded instead of punished, where doing the right thing led to opportunity instead of disaster. He pulled out his phone and stared at it, trying to decide who to call first. Mrs. Chen would want to know. Sophie deserved to understand that their situation had changed, but the words felt impossible to form. How did you explain that losing everything had somehow led to gaining more than you'd ever imagined? A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Chen stood in the doorway, Sophie beside her, both looking at him with identical expressions of concern. "We saw the fancy car," Mrs. Chen said carefully. Sophie was worried. She thought maybe you were in trouble. "Daddy, who was that lady?" Sophie asked, moving to his side with the unconscious trust that children have before the world teaches them wariness. Evan knelt to Sophie's level, taking her small hands in his. "That was Claire Harrington. She owns the building where I used to work, and she came to offer me a new job." Sophie's eyes widened. "A better job? Because you were brave?" "Yes, sweetheart, a much better job. One that will mean I can be home more, that I can come to your school play and have dinner with you and not miss so much of your life." "And we don't have to move?" The question carried weight far beyond its simple words. All the anxiety of a child who'd already lost one parent and lived with the constant fear of losing more. "We don't have to move," Evan confirmed, pulling her into a hug. "In fact, we might be able to move somewhere better. Somewhere with your own room and a park nearby and all the things you deserve." Sophie hugged him tight, her small body shaking slightly with relief or joy, or some combination of both. When she finally pulled back, her face was serious again. "Mrs. Chen said that sometimes when you do good things, the universe finds ways to give back. Is that what happened?" Evan glanced at Mrs. Chen, who smiled gently. "I think maybe it is," he said. "But it took a long time, and it was scary. And there were moments when I wasn't sure if doing the right thing was worth what it cost. But your mom was right. Brave people do find a way, even when it seems impossible." Mrs. Chen moved to the small kitchen area, her voice carrying that practical wisdom that had sustained Evan through his darkest moments. "You need to rest now, real rest. Not the kind where you're checking your phone every 5 minutes waiting for bad news. Sophie and I will make lunch, and you'll eat something, and then you'll sleep. Monday will come soon enough, and you'll need your strength for whatever comes next." She was right, of course. Evan hadn't truly rested in days. Every moment shadowed by worry, every quiet second filled with catastrophic imaginings of what his honesty might cost. But now, with Claire's offer transforming his trajectory from free fall to ascent, the exhaustion hit him like a physical force. He managed to eat the lunch Mrs. Chen prepared, simple soup and bread that tasted like sustenance and safety. Then he collapsed onto his Murphy bed and fell into the deepest sleep he'd experienced since his wife died, dreamless and complete. When he woke, the apartment was dark, and his phone showed it was past 8 p.m. Sophie was asleep on a makeshift bed Mrs. Chen had created using couch cushions and blankets. A note in Mrs. Chen's handwriting sat on the counter. "Didn't want to wake you. Sophie insisted on sleeping near her brave father. See you in the morning." Evan watched his daughter sleep, her face peaceful in a way that made his chest ache with protective love. Everything he'd done, every risk he'd taken, every moment of terror when he'd wondered if he was destroying their lives, had been for her. To give her security, to teach her that integrity mattered, to show her that her father was someone worthy of her trust. The job Claire had offered would change their circumstances dramatically. But more than that, it would prove to Sophie that courage wasn't just about enduring hardship. It was about creating change, about refusing to accept that things had to stay broken just because fixing them was difficult or dangerous. Sunday passed in a haze of normalcy that felt precious precisely because it had been so rare. Evan took Sophie to the park, pushed her on swings, bought ice cream from a vendor, despite knowing he should save money. But the usual anxiety that accompanied small extravagances was muted now, replaced by the knowledge that financial catastrophe was no longer one missed paycheck away. "You're smiling more," Sophie observed as they walked home, her hand sticky from ice cream and warm in his. "You've been sad for so long, but now you're smiling." "I'm happy, sweetheart. For the first time in a long time, I'm actually happy." "Because of the new job?" because things are getting better for both of us. That evening, after Sophie was in bed, Evan opened his laptop and began researching safety compliance, building codes, and corporate governance structures. If he was going to step into this new role, he needed to understand it thoroughly. His lack of formal credentials would make some people question his authority. He'd need to compensate with knowledge and competence that couldn't be dismissed. Monday morning arrived with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness that made Evan feel like a child on the first day of school. Claire's assistant had sent detailed instructions. Arrive at the Harrington Corporation headquarters at 9 a.m. Ask for Jennifer Martinez in HR. Bring identification for new employee processing. The headquarters occupied the top 15 floors of the Harrington Tower, the same building where Evan had worked night security just days ago. Walking through the main entrance felt surreal. The security guards who'd barely acknowledged him when he was one of them now nodded respectfully as he passed, seeing the visitor badge and expensive building address on his destination slip. The elevator ride to the executive floors felt longer than it should have, each floor ticking past like a marker of distance traveled, from basement security desk to executive suite, from invisible to visible, from powerless to empowered. Jennifer Martinez met him in a conference room that had windows overlooking half the city. She was a woman in her 40s with an efficient manner that suggested she'd processed countless new employees and had the routine perfected. Mr. Brooks, welcome to Harrington Corporation. I understand your hiring circumstances are somewhat unusual, but Ms. Harrington has made it clear that you're to receive full executive onboarding. We'll start with paperwork, then move to orientation, and you'll meet with Ms. Harrington at 2 p.m. to discuss your specific responsibilities. The paperwork was overwhelming. Employee agreements, benefits packages, confidentiality clauses, and a salary figure that made Evan's hands shake slightly as he signed. The number on the contract was more than he'd earned in 2 years at his previous jobs combined. More than enough to move out of the studio apartment, to give Sophie her own room, to stop living paycheck to paycheck with disaster, always one setback away. This seems like a lot, he said to Jennifer, gesturing at the salary line, for someone with no corporate management experience. Jennifer's expression softened slightly. Ms. Harrington doesn't make decisions lightly, Mr. Brooks. If she believes you're worth this compensation, then you are. Don't undersell yourself. The orientation covered corporate policies, building access, technology systems, and an introduction to the safety compliance department he'd be overseeing. The current staff, 5 people who'd survived the recent terminations, waited in a conference room with expressions that ranged from curious to hostile. Jennifer made introductions. This is Evan Brooks, your new director. He'll be working directly with Ms. Harrington to restructure safety compliance across all Harrington properties. A woman in her 30s named Sarah Chen spoke first, her tone professional but edged with skepticism. No offense, Mr. Brooks, but the last director had 15 years of experience in facility management and an engineering degree. What's your background? Night security guard, Evan said bluntly, deciding that honesty was the only approach that might work. I started in this building 6 days ago. On my first shift, I found evidence of systematic fraud in the maintenance records. I reported it, got fired for my trouble, and was subsequently hired by Ms. Harrington to make sure nothing like that ever happens again in any property she owns. The room's atmosphere shifted, surprise replacing skepticism, at least partially. An older man named Robert Martinez leaned back in his chair. You're the whistleblower, the one who brought in the fire marshal. I prefer to think of myself as someone who did his job, Evan said. But yes, that was me. So you have no technical background, Sarah pressed. No engineering credentials, no facility management training, no experience managing teams or overseeing complex building systems. That's correct, Evan acknowledged. What I do have is a willingness to ask hard questions, the ability to recognize when something doesn't add up, and the determination to follow through even when it's uncomfortable. Ms. Harrington believes those qualities matter more than credentials. If you disagree, I understand. But I'm here, and I'm going to do this job to the best of my ability. Your choice is whether you want to help me do it well or fight me every step of the way. Sarah and Robert exchanged glances. Then Sarah nodded slowly. All right, we'll give you a chance, but if you start making decisions that compromise safety because you don't understand the technical aspects, we'll go over your head directly to Ms. Harrington. I'd expect nothing less, Evan said. In fact, I'm counting on you to teach me what I don't know. I'm not here to pretend expertise I don't have. I'm here to make sure this company prioritizes safety over convenience and truth over comfortable lies. If I'm making a mistake, I need you to tell me, directly, without politics or posturing. The team's body language relaxed fractionally, not complete acceptance, but the beginning of something that might become respect if he earned it. At 2 p.m., Evan was escorted to Claire Harrington's office, a space that occupied an entire corner of the 53rd floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city. The furnishings were expensive but understated, more functional than ostentatious. This was a workspace, not a showroom. Claire stood when he entered, gesturing to a seating area away from her massive desk. "Evan, how was your first morning?" "Overwhelming," Evan admitted, sitting in a leather chair that probably cost more than his monthly rent. "Your compliance team is skeptical, which I expected. They think you've made a mistake hiring someone with no credentials." "Let them think that," Claire said. "You'll prove them wrong through your work. But I didn't ask you here to discuss team dynamics. I want to talk about what happened with the tower and what we're going to do to make sure it never happens anywhere else." She pulled out a tablet and brought up a presentation. The Harrington Corporation owns or operates 47 properties across 6 states, office buildings, residential complexes, retail spaces. They employ over 15,000 people and serve hundreds of thousands of tenants and visitors. After what we found in the tower, I need to know if we're sitting on similar problems elsewhere. "You want a comprehensive audit," Evan said. "I want more than that. I want someone I trust to personally inspect the most critical systems in every property, someone who isn't looking to protect their department or justify previous decisions. Someone who will tell me the truth, no matter how ugly it is. That's going to take time, and it's going to be expensive if we find problems." "I don't care about the expense," Claire said firmly. "What I care about is making sure that no one gets hurt because we cut corners or trusted people who weren't trustworthy. You exposed the tower's fraud because you cared more about lives than about your job security. That's the mentality I need driving this entire audit process." She leaned forward, her expression intense. "I'm not naive, Evan. I know there are people in this organization who resent the changes happening, who think I'm overreacting, who believe you're some crusading outsider disrupting systems that worked fine before you started asking questions. They're going to push back. They're going to try to undermine you. They're going to test whether I really meant what I said about backing you completely." "And will you?" Evan asked directly. "When it gets political and expensive and uncomfortable, will you still support me exposing problems?" "Yes," Claire said without hesitation. "Because my father built this company on the premise that if you do things right, success follows naturally. Somewhere along the way, we lost that philosophy. We started measuring success by quarterly profits instead of by whether we were creating value that lasted. You're going to help me restore the original vision, even if it means tearing down structures that have stood for decades." Over the next 2 hours, they mapped out a strategy. Evan would spend the next 3 months conducting surprise inspections of all major Harrington properties, starting with the highest occupancy buildings and working down to smaller facilities. He'd have authority to hire outside consultants, to shut down operations that didn't meet code, and to terminate employees who falsified records or obstructed inspections. "I'm essentially giving you permission to create chaos," Claire acknowledged. "Every property you red flag will cost millions to remediate. Every person you expose will have friends and allies who will complain to the board. Are you prepared for that?" Evan thought about his daughter, about the promise he'd made to his dying wife, about the anonymous email from the Harrington Tower employee thanking him for caring about strangers. "I'm prepared," he said, "because the alternative is waiting for something catastrophic to happen and knowing we could have prevented it. I can't live with that. And I don't think you can either." Claire smiled, and for the first time, Evan saw something beyond the corporate armor, genuine warmth, perhaps even relief that she'd found someone who understood what mattered. "No," she agreed, "I can't. Which is why you're exactly the right person for this job, even if your resume suggests otherwise." That evening, Evan picked Sophie up from school himself, no longer dependent on Mrs. Chen's generosity or scrambling to coordinate schedules around night shifts. They walked home slowly, Sophie chattering about her day while Evan absorbed the simple joy of being present in his daughter's life. Are we rich now? Sophie asked suddenly, with the blunt curiosity that children deploy without artifice. We're comfortable, Evan said carefully, which means we don't have to worry as much about money, but we're not rich like Ms. Harrington is rich. But we can stay in our apartment. Actually, I was thinking we might look for a bigger place, somewhere with a bedroom for you and maybe a small yard where you could play. Sophie's face lit up with the kind of pure delight that made every sacrifice worthwhile. Really? A real bedroom? With a door that closes? Really? We'll start looking this weekend. They stopped at a small playground near their building, and Evan pushed Sophie on the swings while the late afternoon sun painted everything in golden light. Other parents gathered in small clusters, discussing schools and schedules and the mundane logistics of family life. Evan had always felt separate from them, marked by loss and struggle, unable to participate in conversations about vacation plans or extracurricular activities. But today, for the first time, he felt like he belonged, like he was building something stable enough to support normal concerns about which soccer league to join or whether piano lessons were worth the investment. "Higher, Daddy!" Sophie called, and Evan pushed the swing with enough force to send her soaring, her laughter bright and unrestrained. This was what he'd been fighting for. Not just survival, but moments like this. The ordinary joy of a father with his daughter on a playground, no longer weighed down by the constant terror of financial collapse or the exhaustion of working through nights while she slept. Later, after dinner and bedtime stories, Evan sat on his couch and called Mrs. Chen. "I wanted to thank you," he said when she answered, "for everything you've done for us. For taking care of Sophie when I couldn't, for believing in me when I wasn't sure I believed in myself." "You don't need to thank me," Mrs. Chen said warmly. "Sophie is a joy, and watching you fight for her, watching you choose integrity over convenience, that's been its own reward. Your wife would be proud of you, Evan, of the father you've become and the man you've remained despite everything." The words hit harder than Evan expected, emotion welling up that he quickly pushed down. "I'm going to be able to pay you back for all the meals, the childcare, everything you've done." "I don't want to be paid back," Mrs. Chen said firmly, "but I will accept help when I need it, just as you accepted help when you needed it. That's what community means. We lift each other up, and we trust that kindness circles back eventually." After they hung up, Evan walked to the window and looked out at the city lights stretching to the horizon. Somewhere out there, the Harrington Tower stood illuminated against the night sky. No longer a place where he walked empty halls in the darkness, but the site of his transformation from invisible to essential. He pulled out his phone and looked at the photo he'd taken of the blinking red light in the mechanical room, the image that had started everything. That warning indicator had been a test, not of his technical knowledge or his corporate savvy, but of his character, of whether he was someone who would see danger and look away, or see danger and sound the alarm regardless of consequences. He'd chosen alarm, and somehow, impossibly, the universe had responded not with punishment, but with reward. The next 6 weeks passed in a blur of inspections, meetings, and learning curves so steep they occasionally felt vertical. Evan traveled to Harrington properties across 3 states, bringing in structural engineers, fire safety specialists, and HVAC experts to verify that systems were functioning as documented. What they found was simultaneously better and worse than he'd feared. Most properties were properly maintained, routine inspections happening on schedule, legitimate contractors doing legitimate work. But in 4 buildings, they discovered varying degrees of fraud similar to what had been happening in the tower. Falsified records, skipped inspections, contractors billing for work never performed. Each discovery meant difficult conversations with property managers, terminations of long-term employees, and expensive remediation projects that made the corporation's quarterly numbers look worse than expected. And with each discovery, Evan faced pushback from people who'd built careers on the status quo. A property manager in Dallas confronted him during an inspection, voice raised enough to draw attention from nearby office workers. "You're destroying lives over paperwork irregularities. These are good people who've worked here for decades. One mistake shouldn't end their careers." "These aren't mistakes," Evan said quietly but firmly. "These are deliberate choices to prioritize cost savings over safety. And yes, there are consequences, because the alternative is waiting for something catastrophic to happen and explaining to families why we knew about problems and did nothing. You're on a crusade, the manager spat. Some righteous mission that's going to cost this company millions and destroy morale across the entire organization. I'm doing my job, Evan corrected. The same job everyone else should have been doing all along. If that feels like a crusade, maybe the problem isn't my standards. It's that the standards have been too low for too long. The confrontations were exhausting, but they were also clarifying. Each instance of resistance confirmed that Claire had been right to bring in an outsider, someone who didn't owe favors or fear political consequences, someone who could make unpopular decisions because his loyalty was to safety rather than to comfortable relationships. Sarah Chen, the skeptical team member from his first day, gradually became an ally. She'd initially questioned his credentials, but his willingness to admit ignorance and defer to expert judgment had earned her respect. You're not like the previous directors, she told him during a site visit to a residential complex in Phoenix. They wanted to appear knowledgeable. You actually want to be correct. That's a big difference. I can't afford to pretend expertise I don't have, Evan said. Too many lives depend on getting this right. That's why it's working, Sarah said. Everyone can tell you actually care. Not about your career or your reputation, but about the actual people who work in these buildings. That's rare at the executive level. By the end of his second month, Evan had established a rhythm. 3 days per week traveling for inspections, 2 days in the office reviewing reports and coordinating with property managers. It was demanding work, but it was also meaningful in ways his previous jobs had never been. He was building something. Creating systems that would protect people long after he was gone. And crucially, he was present for Sophie in ways that had been impossible before. He attended her school play, watching from the audience as she portrayed a tree with absolute commitment to the role. He made dinner most nights, turning their tiny kitchenette into a space where they talked about their days and made plans for their future. He helped with homework, read bedtime stories, and was simply there in a way that exhausted night shifts had made impossible. Daddy, you're different now, Sophie observed one evening as they worked on a math worksheet together. You're still tired sometimes, but you're not sad tired anymore. You're happy tired. That's exactly right, Evan agreed. I'm tired because I'm working hard, but I'm happy because the work matters and I get to spend time with you. That's the best kind of tired there is. They'd moved into a new apartment, a 2-bedroom in a better neighborhood with a small playground across the street and a school Sophie could walk to safely. It wasn't luxury, but it was stability. Space to breathe. A foundation on which to build something lasting. On a Friday afternoon in early December, Evan returned to his office after a week of site visits to find an envelope on his desk. Inside was a handwritten note from Claire Harrington. Board meeting today. Quarterly results below projections due to remediation costs. Some members questioning the safety initiative. Wanted you to hear this from me first. Stand firm. What we're doing matters more than one quarter's numbers. Evan read the note twice, feeling the familiar anxiety that had defined his life for so long trying to resurface. The board was questioning the initiative, which meant they were questioning him, questioning whether an uneducated former security guard should be driving decisions that cost millions. But this time, instead of spiraling into fear, Evan felt something different. Not confidence exactly, but certainty. Certainty that what they were doing was right. That protecting lives mattered more than protecting quarterly profits. That Claire Harrington had given him this position precisely because she knew hard decisions were coming and needed someone willing to make them. He pulled out his phone and looked at a recent photo of Sophie, grinning in her new bedroom, surrounded by stuffed animals and books, secure in ways she'd never been in their old studio apartment. This was what integrity looked like when it was rewarded. Not because the universe was fair or because courage always led to happy endings, but because sometimes, rarely, someone with power recognized value that transcended credentials and traditional metrics of worth. Evan tucked the note in his desk drawer and returned to his work, reviewing inspection reports and planning next month's site visits. The board could question all they wanted. Claire would either support him or she wouldn't, but either way, he'd done his job with honor and competence. He'd exposed fraud, implemented systems to prevent future problems, and built a team that understood safety wasn't negotiable. Whatever came next, he'd face it the same way he'd faced everything since that night in the mechanical room, with honesty, courage, and the determination to be worthy of his daughter's trust. The board meeting Claire had mentioned in her note took place on a Tuesday morning in mid-December, and though Evan wasn't invited to attend, he felt its weight pressing on him throughout the day like atmospheric pressure before a storm. He tried to focus on reviewing contractor bids for the Dallas property remediation, but his mind kept circling back to what was happening 3 floors above him in the executive boardroom. Sarah Chen noticed his distraction around 11 a.m. and appeared at his office door with 2 cups of coffee. "You're worried about the board meeting," she said, setting 1 cup on his desk. It wasn't a question. "That obvious?" Evan asked. "You've checked your phone 14 times in the last hour, and you've been staring at the same contractor proposal for 20 minutes without turning the page." Sarah settled into the chair across from him. "For what it's worth, everyone on the compliance team is behind you. What you've done in 3 months, the fraud you've exposed, the systems you've fixed, it's changed this entire organization. People are taking safety seriously for the first time in years." "But it's cost the company millions," Evan said, "and the board members only see quarterly reports. They don't see the lives we might have saved. They don't see the catastrophes we prevented." "Claire sees it," Sarah said firmly, "and she doesn't back down easily. My cousin works in corporate communications, and she said Claire has been preparing for this board meeting for 2 weeks. She's ready to fight for you." The words should have been comforting, but they only intensified Evan's anxiety. The idea that a billionaire was fighting battles on his behalf felt surreal, like he'd stumbled into a story that belonged to someone else. He was still the widowed father who'd taken a desperate job 6 months ago because he needed to keep the lights on. The fact that he now occupied an executive office and influenced decisions affecting thousands of people hadn't fully penetrated his sense of self. At 1:30, Evan's phone rang with Claire's extension. "Can you come to my office?" she asked, her voice giving nothing away. "There's someone I'd like you to meet." The elevator ride to the 53rd floor felt interminable. Evan straightened his tie. One of 3 he now owned, purchased from a department store during a lunch break because executive directors apparently needed more than the single clip-on he'd worn to his wife's funeral. The small details of his transformed life still caught him off guard sometimes. The salary that had seemed impossible was now something he'd begun to accept as normal. The apartment with Sophie's bedroom no longer felt like borrowed luxury. He was becoming someone different, and the transition was both exhilarating and disorienting. Claire's assistant waved him through immediately. Inside the office, Claire stood with a man in his 60s who carried himself with the particular authority that came from decades of making decisions that affected entire industries. "Evan, this is Richard Chen, chairman of the Harrington Corporation Board," Claire said. "Richard, this is Evan Brooks, our director of safety compliance." Richard extended his hand, and Evan shook it, trying to read the man's expression for clues about what had happened in the board meeting. "Mr. Brooks, I've been hearing a great deal about you," Richard said, his tone neutral. "Claire has been quite vocal about your contributions to this organization. Some of my fellow board members have been equally vocal about the costs associated with your initiatives. I understand that the remediation expenses have impacted quarterly results," Evan said carefully, "but the alternative was leaving dangerous conditions unaddressed. Lives were at risk." "Were they?" Richard asked, settling into one of Claire's leather chairs and gesturing for Evan to sit as well. "Or were you extrapolating worst-case scenarios from maintenance irregularities that might never have caused actual harm?" The question hung in the air, and Evan recognized it for what it was: a test, not of his technical knowledge, but of his conviction, of whether he would back down when challenged by someone with more power and experience. "Sir, with respect, that question assumes we can predict which safety violations will result in catastrophe and which won't," Evan said, keeping his voice steady. The Harrington Towers fire suppression system had been non-functional for 18 months. During that time, nothing happened. No fires, no emergencies. Someone could argue that proved the system wasn't necessary. But what if there had been a fire? What if 50 people had died because we decided that falsified inspection logs weren't worth addressing? "Hypotheticals," Richard said. "Preventable tragedies," Evan corrected. "I'm not willing to gamble with people's lives based on statistical probabilities. And I don't believe Claire is either, which is why she hired me to do exactly what I've been doing." Richard's expression shifted slightly. Not quite a smile, but something close to approval. Claire warned me you wouldn't back down easily. She said you were the most stubbornly principled person she'd ever met, which coming from her is quite the statement. He pulled out a tablet and brought up a presentation. The board spent 4 hours this morning reviewing your work, the fraud you've exposed, the remediation projects you've initiated, the organizational changes you've implemented, and we looked at something else. Statistical models of what could have happened if the tower's fire suppression failure had coincided with an actual emergency. The tablet showed graphs and projections that made Evan's stomach turn. Casualty estimates, liability exposure, criminal charges that could have been filed. The presentation painted a picture of disaster narrowly averted, of lives saved by intervention that had seemed expensive until compared against the alternative. Your work has cost this company $63 million in direct remediation expenses, Richard said. But according to our risk analysts, a catastrophic failure in any of the buildings where you found violations would have cost between $200 million and $4 billion, depending on casualties and criminal liability. From a purely financial perspective, setting aside moral considerations entirely, your initiatives represent the best investment this company has made in a decade. Evan felt something loosen in his chest, relief so profound it was almost painful. The board voted unanimously to expand your authority, Richard continued. You'll now oversee safety compliance not just for Harrington Properties, but for our entire portfolio of subsidiary companies. Claire will provide whatever resources you need, and your compensation will reflect your expanded responsibilities. He stood and offered his hand again. I'll admit, Mr. Brooks, when Claire first told me she'd hired a former security guard with no credentials to direct corporate safety compliance, I thought she'd lost her mind. But she was right, and I was wrong. What this organization needed wasn't another credentialed expert who knew how to navigate corporate politics. It needed someone who gave a damn about doing what was right, regardless of cost or convenience. That's you. Don't lose that quality just because you're successful now. After Richard left, Evan sat in stunned silence while Claire watched him with an expression that might have been amusement. You were worried, she said finally. Terrified, Evan admitted. I thought I'd cost you too much, that the board would force you to fire me and reverse all the changes we've made. They tried, Claire said, moving to sit across from him. 3 board members wanted to shut down the safety initiative entirely, argued that we were being overcautious, that the remediation costs were excessive, that you lacked the credentials to make the decisions you've been making. What changed their minds? Richard did. He's been on this board for 30 years, and he's seen what happens when companies prioritize short-term profits over long-term stability. He ran the numbers, showed them exactly what we avoided by catching these problems early. And then he reminded them that my father built this company on the principle that if you do things right, success follows naturally. We'd strayed from that principle, and you helped us find our way back. Claire leaned forward, her expression serious. I want you to understand something, Evan. This board vote wasn't just about validating your work. It was about defining what kind of company we're going to be. Whether we're going to prioritize people or profits, integrity or convenience, long-term value or short-term gains. And because you had the courage to expose fraud when it would have been easier to stay silent, we chose correctly. I was just doing my job, Evan said quietly. No, Claire corrected. You were doing the job everyone should have been doing all along but weren't. That's the difference between competence and character. Competence can be taught. Character is something you either have or you don't. She pulled out a folder and slid it across the desk. This is your new contract. Executive Vice President of Safety and Compliance. Salary commensurate with your expanded responsibilities. Full authority to implement changes across all Harrington enterprises. And one additional provision that I added personally, an education fund for your daughter. Full scholarship to any university she chooses when the time comes, plus living expenses. Consider it thanks for teaching this organization what integrity actually looks like. Evan opened the folder and stared at the numbers, trying to process what he was seeing. The salary was more than he'd imagined earning in a lifetime. But it was the scholarship fund that broke through his professional composure, the acknowledgement that Sophie's future mattered, that his daughter's dreams were worth investing in. This is too much, he managed. It's exactly right, Claire said firmly. You risked everything to do what was right, not because you thought you'd be rewarded, but because you couldn't live with yourself if you stayed silent. That kind of courage deserves recognition, and your daughter deserves to know that her father's integrity created opportunities for her that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Evan thought about Sophie, about her face when he told her they could move to a bigger apartment, about the way she'd asked if they were rich now, and his careful explanation that they were comfortable. But this was security beyond anything he'd imagined. This was the ability to tell his daughter that her dreams weren't limited by their bank account, that she could become anything she wanted to be, pursue any path that called to her without the weight of financial impossibility crushing her aspirations before they could fully form. "My wife made me promise something before she died," Evan said, his voice rough with emotion he wasn't quite able to contain. "She made me promise to teach Sophie to be brave, to show her that doing the right thing mattered, even when it was hard. I've been trying to honor that promise, but I wasn't sure if I was teaching her courage or just showing her that sacrifice leads to more sacrifice." "And now?" Claire asked gently. "Now I can tell her that courage matters because it changes things. That standing up for what's right doesn't just cost you. It can also transform your life in ways you never expected. That's a better lesson than I could have hoped to teach her," Claire smiled. "Your wife would be proud of you, Evan, of the father you've become and the man you've remained despite everything trying to break you." The words echoed Mrs. Chen's from months ago, and Evan felt the loss of his wife wash over him again. Not the crushing grief that had defined the first year after her death, but something gentler. A sadness mixed with gratitude that he'd had her at all, that she'd shaped him into someone capable of choosing integrity over convenience, even when the cost seemed unbearable. That evening, Evan picked Sophie up from her after-school program and took her to a small Italian restaurant near their new apartment. It was a weeknight splurge, the kind of spontaneous decision that used to be impossible when every dollar had to be carefully allocated to survival. They sat in a booth by the window, Sophie studying the menu with the intense concentration she brought to everything important, and Evan watching her with love so fierce it physically hurt. "Can I get the pasta with the fancy name?" Sophie asked, pointing to a dish that cost more than Evan used to spend on groceries for 3 days. "You can get whatever you want," Evan said, and meant it completely. After they ordered, Sophie looked at him with those serious eyes that seemed to see through all his attempts at adult composure. "Something good happened today," she observed. "You have your happy, excited face, not just your regular happy face." Evan laughed, marveling at his daughter's ability to read his emotions with such precision. "Something very good happened. My job got bigger, which means I can help more people stay safe, and it also means some other good things for us." "Like what?" "Like when you're ready to go to college someday, and I mean real college, any college you want, it's already paid for. You don't have to worry about money or loans or any of that. You can just focus on learning and becoming whoever you want to be." Sophie's eyes widened. "Any college? Even the ones in the big books at the library with the pretty campuses?" "Any college," Evan confirmed. "You could study art or science or literature or engineering or anything else that interests you. The only limit is what you want to do." Sophie was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the gravity it deserved. Then she reached across the table and took his hand, her small fingers warm against his. "Mommy was right about you," she said softly. "She told me before she got too sick to talk much. She said you were the bravest person she knew because you always did what was right, even when it was scary. I didn't really understand what she meant then, but I do now." Evan felt tears prick his eyes and didn't bother trying to hide them. "Your mom was the brave one. She fought so hard to stay with us, and everything I've done since she died has been trying to honor her memory by being the kind of father she believed I could be." "You are," Sophie said with the absolute certainty that children possess before the world teaches them doubt. "You're exactly that kind of father, the kind who keeps promises even when they're really hard to keep." Their food arrived and they ate slowly, savoring not just the meal, but the moment. A father and daughter who'd survived loss and poverty and fear, now sitting together in a warm restaurant, secure in ways that had seemed impossible just months ago. After dinner, they walked home through streets decorated for the approaching holidays. Sophie chattered about her upcoming winter concert at school, about the song her class was learning, about how she had a small solo part that she was both excited and nervous about. "Will you be able to come?" she asked, and Evan heard the vulnerability beneath the casual question. She'd learned not to count on his presence at school events, had adjusted her expectations to match the reality of his unpredictable schedule. "I'll be there," Evan promised. "Front row, if they'll let me. Nothing is more important than watching you sing." Sophie's smile could have powered the entire city. Later that night, after Sophie was asleep in her bedroom, her own room with her own door, and her own space to dream, Evan sat in their small living room and called Mrs. Chen. "I wanted you to know," he said when she answered. "The board expanded my position. Sophie's college is paid for. Everything we've been struggling toward. It's real now. It's secure." "I knew it would be," Mrs. Chen said warmly. "The universe rewards courage, Evan. Not always quickly and not always obviously, but eventually. You planted seeds when you exposed that fraud, and now you're seeing the harvest." "I couldn't have done any of it without you," Evan said. "Without knowing that Sophie was safe with you while I was working, without your support when I thought I was losing my mind from exhaustion and fear." "You're welcome," Mrs. Chen said simply. "But the courage was yours. I just provided a safe place for it to grow." After they hung up, Evan walked to Sophie's bedroom and stood in the doorway, watching her sleep. Her room was filled with the evidence of childhood: stuffed animals and books, drawings she'd made at school, a poster of the solar system that she'd insisted on hanging above her bed because she wanted to fall asleep looking at stars. This was what he'd been fighting for. Not wealth or status or recognition, but this exact moment. His daughter sleeping peacefully in her own room, secure in the knowledge that her father would always be there when she needed him, that her dreams weren't limited by their circumstances, that courage and integrity weren't just abstract concepts, but real forces that could reshape reality. The following weeks passed in a blur of meetings, inspections, and organizational restructuring. Evan's expanded authority meant working with subsidiary companies across multiple industries, implementing safety protocols that had been ignored or given lip service for years. It was demanding work, but it was also deeply satisfying, the feeling of building systems that would protect people long after his direct involvement ended. He hired additional staff for the compliance department, choosing people who shared his commitment to substance over politics. Sarah Chen became his deputy director, bringing technical expertise to complement his instinct for identifying fraud. Together, they created a culture where questioning authority was encouraged, where raising safety concerns was rewarded rather than punished, where doing the right thing was understood to be more important than maintaining comfortable relationships. In January, a fire broke out in one of the Dallas properties that Evan had flagged for remediation. The fire suppression system, newly repaired and properly maintained, activated immediately, containing the blaze to a single office suite. No one was injured. Property damage was minimal. But the incident provided dramatic validation of everything Evan had been arguing for months. Claire called him the day after the fire, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and vindication. "The Dallas property manager just sent me a message. He was one of the ones who fought hardest against your remediation recommendations, said you were being overcautious, that the old system would have been fine. Today, he wrote to thank me for overruling him, said he'd be planning funerals instead of insurance claims if we hadn't fixed that building's safety systems." "How many people work in that building?" Evan asked. 347, Claire said. 347 people who went home to their families last night because you refused to accept that falsified inspection logs were acceptable. That's not an abstract victory, Evan. That's lives saved by someone who cared enough to fight for strangers. The conversation stayed with Evan long after it ended. 347 people, each one with their own story, their own family, their own dreams and obligations. Each one now continuing their life's narrative because a widowed father had decided that blinking red lights mattered more than job security. February brought Sophie's 7th birthday, and Evan threw her a party at their apartment complex's community room. It was a modest celebration by some standards: homemade cake, games organized by enthusiastic but non-professional entertainment, decorations purchased from a party store. But to Sophie, it was perfect. Mrs. Chen came, bringing a hand-knitted scarf that Sophie immediately wrapped around her neck despite the warmth of the indoor space. Sarah Chen came with her 2 kids, who integrated seamlessly into the birthday chaos. Even Claire Harrington made an appearance, bringing a gift that made Sophie's eyes widen: a high-quality telescope for the aspiring astronomer who fell asleep looking at stars. Every child who dreams of understanding the universe deserves the tools to explore it, Claire said when Sophie asked if the telescope was really for her. Your father taught me that investing in people, really investing in their potential, is the most important thing successful people can do. Watching his daughter's joy, surrounded by people who'd become something like family, Evan felt the last traces of the fear and desperation that had defined his life for so long finally release their grip. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was building, creating, establishing a foundation stable enough to support not just immediate needs, but future dreams. As spring arrived and Sophie's school year progressed toward its conclusion, Evan found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him from desperate night security guard to executive vice president. It hadn't been linear or predictable. There had been moments of terror, instances where he'd been certain that doing the right thing would destroy everything he'd been trying to build. But somehow, impossibly, courage had been rewarded. Integrity had created opportunity. Speaking truth to power had resulted not in punishment, but in promotion. And while Evan knew enough about the world to understand that his story was the exception rather than the rule, he also knew that exceptions mattered. They proved that different outcomes were possible, that the cynical assumption that honesty would always be punished wasn't universally true. One evening in late April, Evan and Sophie sat on their apartment's small balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. Sophie was doing homework, a project about heroes that required her to interview someone she admired and write about their courage. "Can I interview you?" she asked, looking up from her notebook. "About the tower and the fire system and everything you did?" "I'm not a hero, sweetheart," Evan said gently. "I just did what anyone should have done." "But most people don't," Sophie said with the wisdom that children sometimes access. "Miss Rodriguez says that heroes aren't people with superpowers. They're regular people who choose to do hard things even when they're scared. That's you, Daddy. You were scared, but you did it anyway." Evan pulled her close, this small person who'd been his reason for everything, his motivation when motivation seemed impossible to find. "All right," he agreed. "You can interview me. But I want you to understand something. The real courage wasn't just reporting what I found. It was all the small choices that came before. Choosing to look when it would have been easier to ignore. Choosing to investigate when it would have been safer to stay incurious. Choosing to care about strangers when I had every reason to only care about us. Those small choices are what made the big choice possible." Sophie wrote this down carefully in her notebook, her handwriting still carrying the careful deliberation of early elementary school. "And because you made those choices, Ms. Harrington gave you a better job and now we have a nice apartment and I can go to any college I want?" "Yes," Evan said, "but more importantly, because I made those choices, hundreds of people are safer. Buildings are properly maintained, and you learn that doing what's right matters, even when it's hard and scary and you're not sure how it will turn out." "I already knew that," Sophie said matter-of-factly. "Mommy taught me that before she died. But you showed me what it looks like in real life. That's even better than just being told." As the sun set completely and the city lights began to glow against the darkening sky, Evan thought about the promise he'd made to his dying wife. The promise to teach their daughter courage, to show her through example what integrity looked like in action. He'd kept that promise. Not perfectly and not without struggle, but genuinely. And in keeping it, he'd transformed not just his own life, but potentially thousands of others, people working in buildings that were now safer because one person had refused to stay silent. That was the real ending, Evan realized. Not the job title or the salary or the security he'd achieved, but the knowledge that he'd honored his wife's memory, kept his promise to his daughter, and made the world measurably better by choosing courage over convenience. Years later, when Sophie was applying to colleges and writing essays about the experiences that had shaped her, she would return to this moment. To her father sitting with her on a balcony, explaining that heroism wasn't about superpowers, but about small choices made consistently, even when they were hard. She would write about watching her father lose everything and somehow gain more than he'd lost. About learning that integrity wasn't just an abstract concept, but a force that could reshape reality. About understanding that the most important question anyone could ask themselves wasn't, "What will this cost me?" but "What will this cost others if I do nothing?" And she would end her essay with a simple truth her father had taught her through example. One honest decision, made when no one was watching, could change the fate of countless lives and redefine what success really meant. But for now, on this spring evening with the city lights glowing and her father's arm around her shoulders, Sophie was simply a 7-year-old girl doing homework, secure in the knowledge that her father loved her enough to fight for strangers, and that such love was the most powerful force in the world. Evan Brooks, former night security guard and current executive vice president, sat with his daughter and watched the city he'd helped make safer, and understood finally that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. That integrity wasn't about grand gestures, but about small choices compounded over time. And that the most important legacy anyone could leave wasn't wealth or status, but the example of a life lived honestly, even when honesty came with a price. The Harrington Tower stood somewhere in the distance, its lights joining thousands of others in the urban constellation. And within its walls, safety systems functioned properly because one man had decided that blinking red lights mattered more than keeping his job. That was the story, not of perfection, but of persistence, not of fearlessness, but of courage, not of success guaranteed, but of integrity honored regardless of outcome. And it was enough, more than enough. It was everything that mattered.